The miasmic breath of the Louisiana swamps clung to New Orleans in 1908 like a shroud woven of decay and forgotten dreams, a humid balm to the city's ancient wounds. Arthur Pym, barely 25, felt its oppressive weight even through the thick walls of his modest office on Royal Street. A weight far more substantial than the dust motes dancing in the meagre sunlight filtering through his grime-streaked window. He was a man of ambition, sharp of intellect and keen of eye, recently graduated with honours from Tulane Law, a public defender whose burgeoning career promised, he hoped, a swift ascent from the squalid indigent cases to the respectable echelons of corporate litigation. Yet the docket for that sweltering August morning presented a challenge that transcended mere professional advancement. It presented the grotesque, the impossible, the Legrasse Defense. The whispers had permeated every stratum of the city since Inspector Legrasse's infamous raid on that unhallowed bayou encampment. Tales of primal drums thrumming beneath a gibbous moon, of cyclopean effigies dredged from primeval mud, and of a half-caste congregation chanting blasphemies in a tongue that twisted the very air. 12 souls, a motley assemblage of individuals whose lineage seemed to blur into something preternaturally ancient, had been apprehended. Their crime, as Legrasse's sensational report detailed, was nothing less than the attempted evocation of monstrous entities from beyond the ken of sane men, a ritualistic conjuration of what the inspector himself, in a moment of unnerving candour, had termed Cthulhu. Pym had initially dismissed the entire affair as the ravings of superstitious provincials, inflamed by Legrasse's own morbid imaginings, perhaps augmented by the fumes of opium or cheap moonshine. It was, he had assumed, a simple case of mass delusion, easily explainable by the insidious power of suggestion within an isolated, uneducated community. An insanity plea, therefore, seemed the only plausible course. He envisioned himself eloquently arguing for their committal to an asylum, thereby safeguarding them from the gallows and securing his own reputation as a defender of the downtrodden, albeit the profoundly deluded. His first visit to the all-in-parish prison, however, began to fray the neatly woven tapestry of his certitudes. The air within the ancient stone edifice was thick with the tang of desperation and despair, but also disturbingly with something else, a cold, alien stillness that seemed to emanate from the 12 cells now housing Legrasse's captives. They were segregated, of course, a concession to the racial prejudices of the age, but their shared predicament lent them an unnerving uniformity. Their faces, though varied in hue and feature, bore a common cast of impenetrable calm, an eerie resignation that bordered on comprehension. The first man Pym interviewed was a Creole of indeterminate age, a fisherman named Jacques, his eyes like polished obsidian, devoid of fear or remorse. Pym began with the standard queries, probing for signs of mental instability, auditory hallucinations, or grandiose delusions. Jacques answered not with the rambling incoherence Pym expected, but with a quiet, unnervingly articulate clarity. "They say we sought to call him forth, monsieur," Jacques stated, his voice a low thrum. "And they are not wrong, but they do not understand why." Pym leaned forward, scribbling notes. "You admit to these rituals? To believing in this Cthulhu?" Jacques smiled, a thin, humorless slash. "Believe? One does not believe in the geometry of the sphere, monsieur. One comprehends it. We sought to open the door, for the stars were right, and the cycle was upon us. He spoke of cycles, not of faith, of geometry, not of incantations. Pym felt a prickle of unease. What geometry, Jacques? What cycle? And then Jacques began to speak, not of visions or voices, but of numbers, of angles, of stellar alignments that defied earthly reckoning. He described constellations Pym had never heard of, their positions not in the familiar sky above, but in a deeper, more terrible firmament. He drew diagrams on the dusty cell floor with a finger, intricate non-Euclidean constructs that twisted the very fabric of perception, challenging Pym's ingrained understanding of space. His explanations were precise, dispassionate, mathematical. They spoke of the curvature of the cosmos, of dimensions folded and unfolded, of entities whose forms were not solid, but configurations of forces visible only through specific terrifying lenses of perception. "The angles are all wrong," Jacques had murmured, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. "Not just on Earth, but in the great beyond. And those angles are his house." Pym left the prison that day with a nascent dread coiling in his gut. The logical, albeit alien discourse of Jacques was far more unsettling than any gibbering madness could have been. Madness, Pym understood. This was something else. Subsequent interviews intensified Pym's disquiet. An elderly woman, Mama Odette, spoke of ancient bloodlines and inherited memories, not as folklore, but as a verifiable lineage stretching back to epochs pre-human, when vast unthinking consciousnesses stirred in the deep. Her words painted a picture of humanity as a fleeting, fragile growth upon a colossal, indifferent cosmic organism. She described in meticulous detail certain geological anomalies in the swamps, specific strata, peculiar rock formations, the fossilized impressions of impossible fauna, and then linked them to stellar configurations recorded in Precambrian ice cores, information she claimed was passed down through generations of those who remember. Pym, despite himself, found himself considering the possibility, however faint and monstrous, that her claims might possess a terrifying internal consistency. Then there was the young Chinese man, Chan, who spoke in heavily accented but surprisingly erudite English. He was a scholar, Pym learned, a disillusioned disciple of Confucius who had found a different kind of truth. Chan described intricate algorithms, patterns of sound and light that, when correctly aligned, could resonate with frequencies beyond human audibility, frequencies that hummed within the very structure of the cosmos. He detailed a kind of cosmic harmonics, a mathematics of vibration that could, if amplified and focused, tear holes in the veil between dimensions. He spoke of observing subtle shifts in the behavior of deep-sea organisms, of changes in the magnetic fields of the Earth during specific lunar cycles, and of how these phenomena aligned precisely with ancient texts his ancestors had guarded for millennia, texts that were not religious scriptures but observational logs. "The universe is a song, Mr. Pym," Chan had said, his eyes devoid of emotion. "And he is the deepest bass note, eternally resonating, waiting for the chord to strike." Pym found himself poring over astronomical charts, geological surveys, and obscure ethnographic texts in the weeks leading up to the trial. He devoured accounts of primordial myths, finding unsettling parallels between the cultists' proofs and the fragmented, often suppressed knowledge of ancient civilizations. He even in a moment of desperate rationality, sought out a disgraced Tulane professor of astrophysics, Dr. Aris Thorne, known for his eccentric theories concerning anomalous cosmic background radiation. Thorne, a skeletal man with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intensity, had listened to Pym's carefully worded, hypothetical questions about mathematically coherent descriptions of impossible entities with a disturbing lack of surprise. Thorne had shown Pym a series of complex equations, hypothetical models for hyperdimensional interaction, he'd called them. They involved Riemannian geometry and concepts of spatial topology that made Pym's head ache with their sheer abstraction. Yet, as Thorne pointed to certain variables, certain constants, Pym saw, with a sickening lurch, how they mirrored the crude diagrams Jacques had traced on the prison floor, how they resonated with the cosmic harmonics Chan had described. "It is all theoretical, of course," Thorne had rasped, running a bony hand through his wispy hair. "But theoretically, Mr. Pym, if certain conditions were met, if the correct angles were perceived, if the mind were prepared, then it is not impossible for an entity, a consciousness of immense non-Euclidean scale, to manifest across dimensional barriers. Not supernatural, Mr. Pym, just unnatural. Unnatural in a way that would shatter the fragile glass of human reason." The professor's words had echoed the cultist's own, driving a cold spike of horror into Pym's heart. He was no longer dealing with madmen. He was dealing with individuals who possessed a terrifying, unified understanding of a reality far more vast and horrific than any he had ever conceived. Their insanity was merely their acceptance of a truth that sane minds mercifully rejected. The trial was set to commence in early October. The courtroom, a grand if slightly decaying edifice of civic pride, was packed. News of the Legrasse raid had reached national newspapers, sensationalizing the bayou devil worshippers and attracting an array of morbidly curious spectators. Judge Alistair Finch presided, a man whose stern visage barely concealed a deep-seated contempt for anything that challenged the ordered rationality of his world. Prosecutor Thomas Barlow, a man of booming voice and impeccable reputation, was known for his ability to sway juries with an appeal to common sense and moral outrage. Pym, standing before the bench, felt a cold sweat prickle his hairline. His initial strategy, the insanity plea, now seemed like a grotesque farce. How could he argue for the mental derangement of men and women whose arguments, however terrifying, were internally consistent, backed by a chillingly coherent, if utterly alien, logic? If he presented their proofs as evidence of their insanity, he risked revealing the very truths that had begun to dismantle his own carefully constructed worldview. His public defender's ethics screamed at him, defend your clients, secure their freedom. But at what cost? To unleash the Legrasse Defense, to present their rational mathematical proofs of Cthulhu's existence to a jury of ordinary citizens, would be to risk their minds, their sanity, perhaps even their very souls. He recalled Thorne's chilling pronouncements, the diagrams Jacques had drawn, the ancient chants Mama Odette had hummed. These were not mere delusions, they were keys to a forbidden vault, and opening it, even to save his clients, felt like an act of cosmic treason. The prosecution opened, painting the defendants as dangerous, deluded fanatics, their rituals a threat to Christian society and public order. Barlow called Legrasse himself to the stand, who, in a crisp, authoritative tone, recounted the horrors of the raid, the unholy chanting, the stench of decay, and something else, something profoundly wrong, emanating from the swamp, the unnatural stillness of the cultists, even as they were apprehended. He described the idols recovered, objects of an utterly alien craftsmanship that defied earthly geology and art history, objects he prudently kept off the jury's direct view, presenting only sketches that hinted at their blasphemous forms. Pym's cross-examination of Legrasse was designed to expose the inspector's biases, his penchant for the sensational, but Legrasse remained unshaken, his composure unnerving. "Mr. Pym," Legrasse had said, his eyes meeting Pym's with an unsettling intensity, "I assure you, what we encountered that night transcends mere human depravity. It was a glimpse beyond the veil, a glimpse of something ancient, something hungry." Pym called his first witness, Dr. Alistair Finch, no relation to the judge, a renowned psychiatrist, to testify to the sociological aspects of cult behavior and shared delusion. Dr. Finch eloquently explained the psychological mechanisms behind such phenomena, suggesting that the cultists, isolated and under the sway of charismatic leaders, could collectively experience powerful hallucinations and construct elaborate, self-reinforcing belief systems. It was a solid, if predictable, start to the insanity plea. But, as Dr. Finch spoke, Pym glanced at his clients in the jury box. Their faces were impassive, almost bored. They understood, Pym realized with a sickening lurch, that Dr. Finch's theories were merely human attempts to categorize the uncategorizable, to rationalize the fundamentally irrational from a human perspective. Their truth lay beyond such facile explanations. Then came Pym's decision. He had to present his clients to let their voices be heard. He called Jacques, the Creole fisherman, to the stand. The court buzzed with anticipation. Pym had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, grappling with the ethical quagmire. He would present Jacques' proofs, not as truth, but as symptoms of a profound collective psychosis, hoping to secure a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. It was a perilous tightrope walk. "Mr. Jacques," Pym began, his voice surprisingly steady, "can you describe to the court the beliefs, the understanding that led you to the actions you took that night in the swamp?" Jacques turned his obsidian eyes to the jury, his gaze sweeping over their faces, not with menace, but with an almost pitying comprehension. "Beliefs, monsieur? One does not believe the tides. One observes their ebb and flow. We observed the cosmos." He proceeded to outline his geometry. He spoke of the spatial distortions that occur at specific stellar conjunctions, not as magical events, but as quantifiable shifts in the very fabric of reality. He described how the intersection of certain stellar axes at certain points in Earth's orbit created nodes, where the barriers between dimensions thinned. He explained these concepts with a dispassionate, almost academic tone, using terms like Riemannian manifold, Hilbert space, and trans-Euclidean vectors. The jury, initially confused, began to show signs of discomfort. Barlow objected, citing irrelevance, but Pym argued that this was the very essence of his client's state of mind. Judge Finch, bewildered but intrigued, allowed it. Jacques then began to draw. On a large slate, Pym had provided Jacques etched lines, curves and angles that defied conventional perspective, forms that seemed to shift and shimmer even as one looked at them. They were not two-dimensional. They hinted at deeper, impossible geometries, configurations that seemed to suggest a presence, that was simultaneously vast and impossibly intricate. He spoke of the angles of his house, and the courtroom grew cold. A juror, a portly butcher, began to fan himself frantically, his face paling. Another, a nervous schoolteacher, clutched her crucifix. "These are not symbols, monsieur," Jacques concluded, pointing to his drawing, "but the very architecture of his being. When the stars are right and the angles are revealed, his form can be glimpsed, however briefly, through the rent veil. His existence is not a matter of faith, but of cosmic mathematics." The air in the courtroom became heavy, charged with an unspoken dread. Jacques' calm, rational exposition of the utterly irrational was far more effective than any ranting could have been. It bypassed the intellect and burrowed directly into the primal fears of the human mind, whispering of a universe that cared nothing for humanity's neat classifications. Pym then called Mama Odette. She spoke of the great sleepers not as mythical gods, but as biological imperatives of a pre-existent consciousness. She delved into the deep genetic memory, the atavistic echoes that resonated within certain bloodlines, passed down through epochs. She described the Earth not as a stable sphere, but as a living organism whose deepest currents, its magmatic core, its oceanic trenches, pulsed with an ancient alien sentience, a consciousness that merely slumbered, dreaming its cosmic dreams. She spoke of the tremors that preceded the Great Awakening, not as earthquakes, but as the stirring of a titan. "The soil remembers, child," she croaked, her eyes fixed on the jury, "and the blood remembers. He is not coming. He is here, always. We simply forget where to look until the stars remind us." Her testimony, infused with an eerie ancestral wisdom, invoked a sense of deep time, of human insignificance against geological and cosmic scales. The jury was visibly shaken. One woman began to weep silently. Last, Pym called Chan. The young Chinese man spoke of the cosmic harmonics, of the precise sonic frequencies that could disrupt the veil between dimensions. He described the chants not as prayers, but as intricate, multi-layered vibrational equations designed to resonate with specific energies. He spoke of observing the behavior of deep-sea squid and the migration patterns of whales, and how these seemingly unrelated phenomena were, in fact, subtle precursors, biological sensors reacting to the imminent shift in cosmic energies. He even provided a small, intricately carved bone flute, an object of unsettling design, and described its purpose in creating specific tones that could hypothetically attract a non-local entity. He did not play it, but the mere sight of it, coupled with his calm explanation, was enough. "They are not devils, monsieur," Chan concluded, his voice soft but unwavering. "They are merely deaf. They hear only the shallow music of their world, not the symphony of the cosmos, not the deep resonance of his eternal dream." Pym rested his case. The courtroom was utterly silent, a profound, heavy quietude that stretched tautly, broken only by the occasional nervous cough or shudder. He had walked the line, presenting their proofs in such a way that they could be interpreted as the elaborately constructed delusions of a shared psychosis. Yet he had also allowed the insidious logic of their arguments to seep into the collective consciousness of the jury. He had not explicitly stated, "Cthulhu is real," but he had allowed the cultists to present their evidence with such disarming rationality, such chilling coherence, that the alternative, that they were merely mad, seemed almost a comforting lie. Barlow's rebuttal was forceful, a furious appeal to common sense, to Christian values, to the sanctity of human reason. He called the cultists' testimonies blasphemous ramblings, gibberish designed to confuse and mislead. He emphasized the dangerous nature of their rituals, the threat they posed to society. But even as he spoke, Pym could see the cracks in his facade, the subtle flicker of doubt in his eyes. Barlow himself had been exposed to the Legrasse Defense, and it had taken its toll. The jury retired. The hours that followed were an eternity. Pym sat alone in his office, the pervasive dread now a cold, familiar companion. He had won, in a sense. He had upheld his duty, presenting his client's case with all the intellectual rigor he could muster. But at what cost? His own mind, once a fortress of logical thought, was now riddled with fissures. He found himself scrutinizing the shadows in his office, seeing unsettling patterns in the weave of his rug, hearing faint, unearthly whispers in the distant rumble of the city. He looked at the familiar, comforting geometry of his desk, his books, and saw only a fragile, arbitrary construct, a thin veneer over a reality of shifting angles and impossible forms. When the verdict finally came, it was not guilty by reason of insanity. A hollow victory. The cultists would be committed to the state asylum, a fate Pym had initially sought. But the jury's decision was not born of simple pity for the mentally infirm. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. Pym had seen their faces when they returned, pale and drawn, their eyes distant and troubled. They had been spared the direct, sanity-blasting revelation of Cthulhu's truth, but the seeds of that truth had been sown. They had heard enough. They had understood enough to know that the world they thought they knew was a comforting deception. They had chosen to label the source of their terror as madness, not because it was the most logical conclusion, but because it was the only way to preserve their own tenuous hold on sanity. As Pym watched his clients led away, their faces still impassive, still bearing that unsettling calm, he knew he had both succeeded and failed. He had saved them from the gallows, but he had opened a door, however slightly, for others. The Legrasse Defense had not only argued for the cultists' freedom, it had insinuated a cosmic horror into the very heart of human reason. Pym returned to his office, the gas lamps casting long dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with unspoken secrets. He looked at his hand, at the familiar lines of his palm, and felt a profound disconnect. The world no longer seemed solid, no longer trustworthy. The subtle mathematical proofs of alien gods, the chillingly rational arguments for cosmic dread, had not been banished by the verdict. They had merely receded into the unacknowledged corners of his own mind, lurking, waiting. He had looked into the abyss, and while it had not completely swallowed him, it had shown him its terrifying geometries. He was free, ostensibly, but forever imprisoned by a knowledge too vast, too ancient, too utterly unnatural for the human soul to bear. The humid night air of New Orleans, once merely oppressive, now seemed to whisper of things in the deep, of angles that were truly wrong, and of the ultimate, terrifying indifference of the cosmos. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his marrow, that the trial was not over. For Arthur Pym, it had only just begun. The old ones merely dreamt, and sometimes in their dreams they hummed a tune that shattered the waking world. And Pym, poor, ambitious Pym, had learned to hear the music.